Morning, class. My name is Mr. Somerville, and I am going to be your teacher for today. Now, there are certain stories you trust, and there are certain stories that cannot be trusted. Back in my day, there was this story that went around my friend's school for a long time about a young man who stole sodium from the chemistry lab and flushed it down the toilet. Apparently, it caused this massive explosion. I remember thinking at the time, if I'm going to believe this story, I'm going to need a few things. Firstly, I want to hear directly from someone who was there. And failing that, I'm going to need at least 5 other stories from people in that school, and if their stories match up, then I might be prepared to believe it. Generally speaking though, if you hear a really crazy and suspicious story through a friend's friend, chances are you'll be slow to believe it. But if you overhear a few of your friends talking about you, you're gonna believe that. You trust the source, and since they don't know that you're listening, it means they're probably telling the truth. The same is true for the people who wrote the accounts of Jesus' life. Now hear me out. These writers would have never thought that their accounts would be overheard by millions, or that 2,000 years later, that their accounts would still be read and become part of the best-selling book of all time. They were just writing them down for their friends and for local communities who wanted to know more. And these short books are known as the Gospels, which just means good news, and they're written by 4 people: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's a common question about these books, and in fact the Bible. Is what we read in our Bible today the exact same as what it would have been 2,000 years ago, and can it be trusted? Because there's a common critique of Christianity that the source writings of Jesus were altered due to whatever agenda the early Christians may have had. So can we trust them? Well, historians look for a number of things when deciding if an ancient piece of writing is reliable or not. They'll ask questions like, how soon was it written after the actual events? How many copies of the history do we have, and are they accurate? And are there records from eyewitness testimonies?
Take Alexander the Great, one of the most famous conquerors of the ancient world. He was born 300 years before Jesus. However, the only surviving accounts were written at least 300 years after his death. 2 were written by historians Arrian and Plutarch, who obviously did not know Alexander or anyone from that century. But despite the time gap, we generally accept their histories as the most reliable sources on him, because none of the original accounts, written while he lived, have survived. We've all heard of the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar, born July 100 BC. But the interesting thing is that in the 1,000 years after his death, we know of only 20 copies of the account of his life. Despite the tiny amount of information we have available to us, we take these accounts as history. And to be clear, I'm not saying that these accounts shouldn't be taken seriously. And here's the interesting thing. Based on historical accuracy, there's more reason to believe the accounts of Jesus than that of Alexander the Great or Caesar. The original documents were written down just after Jesus' life, some within just 30 years, and there were still eyewitnesses around who could confirm the details. And when it comes to relying on the accuracy of copying, we have more than 5,000 ancient manuscripts that contain part or all of the New Testament, and that's just in Greek. We have over 8,000 copies in Latin, and then 9,000 in many other languages. And it was all done within 300 years of Jesus' death. Compare that to the mere 20 copies we have of Caesar's history after 1,000 years. So when it comes to historical record, I think Jesus is in a league of his own. His story went viral, and it happened within a generation. Not bad for the child of an unwed refugee peasant living in an obscure corner of the world's greatest empire. So if we accept that the accounts of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar are historical, reliable sources, should we not then be willing to accept the historical accounts of Jesus? There's a decent chance that you're watching this thinking, I can't remember what I ate for breakfast this morning, let alone 15 years ago. There's no way anyone would have remembered Jesus' life and teachings in detail, particularly 30 years after he died.
Fair point. But consider this.
Our world is very different from the world that Jesus and his disciples lived in. In our digital world, we don't exercise any of the mental muscles that they would have had because our devices remember for us. My dad even has to check his phone contacts just for his own number. Now, he is old.
Hey!
But how many numbers do you know? Do you even know your own? In first century Jewish culture, the ability to remember was unbelievably impressive. When a rabbi like Jesus invited disciples to follow him, they were embarking on a journey that would require them to consume vast amounts of information and remember it. Since this was before the days of printing, learning was mostly communicated through the spoken word, and the average mind was culturally wired to digest and repeat this information, often word for word. As part of their training, many rabbis would have memorized the entire Hebrew scriptures. That's the entire Old Testament. In my Bible, that's like 1,000 pages. It's like memorizing an entire science textbook. Most of us have some sort of experience of the Bible, for better or for worse. Because it's all bound together, you can assume that it's just one book, but it's actually not as simple as that. The word Bible comes from the Latin word biblia, which just means the books. And so that's what the Bible is. It's a collection of loads of books written by individuals to friends and communities. You can see this in the way that Luke's gospel is written. It's essentially a letter from Luke to his friend Theophilus. Luke wrote to him and said this: "Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They use the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write a careful account for you so that you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught." Luke worked hard to get his facts straight about Jesus, but it's not as if he posted online and it got 1 million shares. It's more that his personal email to Theophilus was forwarded to the world. So what we have then is Luke and 3 other writers telling the same story, but from different perspectives. So why is there still much doubt about the reliability of these eyewitness accounts? The answer is that no matter how much evidence there are to support them, these stories will always be tough to believe. Now, if it was just a guy walking around teaching, then many wouldn't have a problem. The problem is that these stories are full of the supernatural, miracles. But what makes these stories hard to believe is also the very thing that makes them worth believing. Miracles are always tough to prove because they go beyond our understanding of how the world works. But what I want to suggest is that if we apply the principles and practices of historians, there's a good case for accepting that Jesus performed miracles. Firstly, we have the gospel accounts, and each account describes miracles of many kinds. There are blind people regaining sight, dead people being raised, demons being driven out, and raging storms being instantly stilled. Would Jesus have been able to draw crowds of thousands over a span of 3 years from his baptism at 30 to his death at 33 if he was a fake the whole time? And secondly, no one ever actually denied that he performed the miracles. Now, it's no surprise that those who loved and supported him would acknowledge what he did, but what is surprising is that the religious leaders who wanted him dead acknowledged them too. They never questioned his miraculous abilities. What they questioned was the source of his power. They accused him of being evil. Finally, we must ask the question, why is Jesus, an obscure Jewish teacher, the most historically verifiable person in history? Why is there more written about him than any other king or emperor that lived before or after him? I suggest that he must have done something extraordinary. Which one of us hasn't exaggerated a few details? I may not have been completely honest about what I said I was doing at the weekend. In reality, I was right here, playing with my kids by the pool. But what I told people I was doing was riding the waves on this awesome speedboat! Yeah! We're all guilty of exaggerating a few details. Like, I don't own this boat. But this tendency in all of us is something that people point to when they talk about Jesus and how people remembered it. Some will suggest that maybe the disciples exaggerated parts of the Jesus story. When we exaggerate or make up stories, certainly in my own life, it's generally to make ourselves look better. So, could the disciples have made up the life of Jesus, or could they exaggerate a bit? Possibly, but I doubt it, and I doubt it for a few reasons. Firstly, throughout the Gospels, we find these distracting and seemingly irrelevant details that point to them being eyewitness accounts that wouldn't match up with fiction writing of that era.
These details don't have the air of the spectacular or the fantastical. For example, during a great storm, Jesus is sleeping below deck on a cushion. There's an unusual story about a man wearing a linen cloth, and when the guards tried to arrest him alongside Jesus, they grabbed his cloth and he ran away, naked. Jesus calls out to Peter, whose boat is about 100 yards from shore, and they catch 153 fish. It's weirdly specific.
They sound more like the insignificant tidbits that come from remembering rather than made-up storytelling. Today, when people are writing fiction, they add details like that to make the story sound more believable. But that type of writing didn't even occur until the 18th century. Besides, if the disciples were doing that, that means they are intentionally lying. And do they have a motive for that? Like, if they are intentionally making this up, why would they use names of people that are still alive at that time who could easily be asked about the event to see if it happened or not?
We read stories of Jesus in different parts of the Bible, like when Jesus testifies before political leaders Herod and Pontius Pilate. He meets privately with a man called Nicodemus. He heals Jairus' daughter, and the father of Alexander and Rufus helped Jesus carry his cross. If you were creating a highly altered or fictional account of a supernatural Jesus, you wouldn't include the names of real people in real places easily accessible for your listeners to go and ask them about it.
Also, if you're writing yourself into a great story that makes you the follower of Jesus, the Son of God, you don't go out of your way to make yourself and others look like idiots, do you? If the Gospels were fiction, then the disciples, who went on to become the leaders of the early church, would have painted themselves as awesome, if not superhuman. Yet what we find is stories of their immaturity and even their foolishness.
James and John asked permission to call down lightning on an unbelieving village. Peter denies being a follower of Jesus 3 times on the day Jesus died. On more than one occasion, Jesus has to stop the disciples fighting about which one of them is going to be the greatest. So if you're going to invent a story that will give you power, or make you the leader of a movement like Peter, you don't tell the story in a way that makes you look like you can't be trusted to use a pair of scissors without supervision.
And speaking of the leader of the early church, the Gospels record this moment where Jesus calls Peter Satan. You know, God's arch enemy, the devil. You can be sure that if Jesus called me Satan to my face, I wouldn't be tweeting about it, but it's in there because presumably it actually happened. Finally, if you're making up a story about Jesus being the Son of God and walking among us, why would you emphasize his humanity? Why would you say that he grew tired and hungry? Why would you invent a story about him weeping and sweating blood as he prays not to be crucified? Why would you invent a story of Jesus being killed in the most gruesome, brutal, and humiliating way possible? And if the disciples did invent such a story, why does history tell us that they died defending it?